Welcome to the Cambridge Health Alliance Health is Wealth. My name is Roberta Robinson. I'm Director of Marketing and Outreach for the Geriatric Division of the Cambridge Health Alliance, as well as the PACE program. Today, I'm really very excited about having Ester, Serra, Luque?
Yes, perfect.
Hey, I did it.
You did very well.
From Transition House, coming to this program today, because I'm very excited about it, because it's a subject that we don't always hear about. It's usually can be still in this day and age, swept under the rug.
Yeah.
So it's about domestic violence, right? So Esther, tell us what constitutes domestic violence.
Yeah. So the way the we
Oh,
talk
by the
about
way,
it-
welcome.
Oh, thank you very much. It's
Welcome,
great to
and
be
thank you
here.
for being here.
Thank you so much. So the way that we talk about domestic violence is we start talking about healthy and unhealthy relationships. We all have relationships. We always joke they're not always perfect. You know, it's like everybody raise your hand if you've never had a fight with your wife, with your husband, with your boyfriend or girlfriend. Nobody. So we talk about healthy and unhealthy relationships. Healthy being, you know, you have communication about things. Everybody in the relationship has the same amount of input, making decisions. Power is shared. That doesn't mean we both do the same things, but it's equal.
Or that you agree all the time.
Or that we agree all the time, but the decisions are shared.
But you have a way to work through it,
Exactly.
right? And compromise,
Exactly.
maybe.
And the way that you communicate with each other is respectful, and even when you get angry, then you're able to have a conversation about it. And then at the other extreme, there's unhealthy relationships. And we wouldn't call those necessarily abusive, but they're relationships that, you know, there's no good communication. Sometimes they can be even very destructive to each other's self-esteem. Where, you know, sometimes name-calling communication doesn't work well. You're not really making decisions, so that if we have an argument, it's like, okay, whatever, so you do whatever you want and I'll do whatever I want, and that's it. And nobody actually negotiates. And then in that extreme, but a little further, we talk about domestic violence or abusive relationships. And those are a step further. But I think having that context on how that works is important, because especially when we work, when we do community workshops, we talk about this whole range, right? Because it's good to understand the dynamics in order to see the red flags when we're looking for domestic violence. And when we talk about domestic violence, sometimes what's the first thing that comes to mind, right? When we say domestic violence?
Well, physical abuse.
Exactly.
Physical abuse is the first thing that comes to mind.
So people imagine physical violence, bruises. So, domestic violence will be very easy to spot, right? Because I'm going to see if somebody has been beat up. Well, not always. Because the principle of underneath all these kinds of relationships is abuse of power and control. So it's a relationship where one person wants to and tries to always have power and control over the other person. And that can be done in many, many different ways. And one of them is physical violence, and many times it happens. But we, for example, work with people that have never experienced physical violence, but they have experienced a lot of other controlling behaviors. For example, not being allowed to leave the house, not having access to your money, or having your money taken away as soon as you get your paycheck.
Control of the purse strings.
Exactly.
Oh, yes.
Using your immigration status, for example, also to keep you from preventing you from doing certain things. Yelling.
Holding it over your head.
Yep. Exactly. So, well, if you don't do so and so, I'm going to report you to immigration, or I'm not going to sponsor you for your green card. But also things like just putting you down and using emotional abuse to make you feel less, to make you feel that you actually can leave that relationship. The type of things are where somebody tells you, well, nobody will want you. Oh, you want to leave? Sure, go ahead. Nobody will want you. You're good for nothing.
Right.
So all this kind of name
And it
calling.
whittles away your self-confidence and your self-esteem.
Right. Yeah, and these things all together, we always say it's really hard that you see only one type of abuse. We talk about different types of tactics that happen within domestic violence. Physical is the most obvious, but there's also sexual violence that happens within married couples, between like boyfriend and girlfriend relationships. There's also financial abuse, as I was saying. There's also emotional and verbal abuse, and usually all these things happen together in different degrees. And even when there has been physical violence, we work with people that are still in abusive relationships and just figure out how to stay safe in them, or how to leave them. And we work with people that for years there hasn't been any physical violence, but because there was at some time, that fear is there. So
the threat of
exactly.
if you don't do what I want you to do.
Right. I already got physical ones, so that's a possibility. So this is why sometimes we don't see any bruises and we don't see physical violence.
Right. But we have the person that is the victim in this situation. There's sort of a syndrome, isn't there, that they end up in. And, some of us on the outside would say, well, why don't you just leave?
Right.
But it's not that easy.
Right.
Right. There's so much that goes into it that works to sort of enmesh them and lock them in.
Right.
Right? It's so complicated.
Yeah.
And if there are any children involved, and the money, and if you're not working, and it goes on and on and on and on and on. Right?
Yeah. I think a lot of times, many years ago, there was even this totally unfounded belief that, there was something wrong with the person that was being abused in the relationship. Oh, they must like it, because if they don't leave immediately.
Oh, brother.
And then I always ask people, well, actually now, what the studies show of programs that work with batters, with people who have abusive behaviors, is that actually it's very common that among people who are abusive to their partners, there's this thread of actually you look for a certain type of person as a partner, right? So it's not the person who is the victim that is like, I don't know what happens to me, which a lot of people tell us. It's like, I just keep getting into these kinds of relationships, right? Like,
oh, I know how that works. I know how that works.
Right?
Yeah, it's a conditioning.
Exactly.
Intelligence has nothing to do with it, I'm happy to tell you.
Absolutely.
It's a
nothing.
conditioning.
And
a familiar, what you're familiar with.
Right, but it's also the fact that people who are abusive and controlling search for certain vulnerabilities.
Right.
Search for people that they think because of your lack of family connections, or because of your lack of income, or because of your personality, you're a very giving person, that they're going to be able to use that to control you. So we look at it from a more like predatory perspective of like they're actually looking for you, so it's not surprise that they find you.
Right. And it's sort of like it appears to be, I'm going to use this loosely, but like a match made in heaven, that it just one person plays one part, one person plays the other part, that gets them together, and there we have it.
Right.
Right.
And also the piece that we were talking about, eroding your self-esteem, which is one of the first things that happens in these relationships, right? You fall in love with somebody, you trust their opinion, you trust their behavior, and then something happens that kind of shakes your world, and it's like, whoa. And then the person apologizes, and they make it sound like it might have been your fault a little bit, and you love that person, you trust them, you're like, wow, and you're the kind of person that actually self-analyzes and says, okay, I'm going to take a little bit of responsibility. So this is actually very common, that this is turned against you, and the lower your self-esteem is, the easier it is to actually stay in this kind of relationship.
Right, the more helpless you get.
Right.
And the more helpless and hopeless you feel.
And also people who are abusive work very smartly to disconnect you.
Right. Oh, yes, they like you marooned.
Exactly.
Yes.
We always say one of the red flags we always tell people is like, okay, if you're in any doubt that your relationship is, let's just call it unhealthy, start looking at your life, see if your life has, funneled down and gotten smaller. Did you used to have a lot of activities, you had a lot of friends, you used to go out every week, and that's not only the only thing, or you had a very close relationship with your family, you were calling your mom every day, and now you find yourself like, either you don't feel like it, or every time that you try to do some of these things, something happens. And you find yourself saying, I actually haven't talked to my mom in like a month. So this is a sign not that by itself, but it's this thing that abusive people are very good at cutting
Isolating.
exactly
Yeah.
cutting you off from your connections,
Right.
which makes it much easier for all the what we call the crazy making, right? To
Right.
happen, to make you believe it's your fault,
Right.
to make you feel like, you know, that's the best you can get.
Right. And then sometimes if it happens as an episode with alcohol, and then the person is not abusive when they're not drinking,
Yeah.
then sometimes they forgive
Right.
that, and they say, well, that happens then, and then they kind of excuse it and
Yeah.
it puts it in a different compartment.
Exactly.
I think, huh?
Yeah. We get asked a lot actually when we do workshops about alcohol and drugs and their effect on it, and we always say is like it's true, alcohol can enhance behaviors, but when we talk about domestic violence, we're also talking about a pattern of these abusive behaviors, so repetitive things that are happening across the line for a while.
Right.
So we always say, yep, there could be a one time where somebody who is the nicest person in the world gets drunk and gets on a fight or does something completely ridiculous, right?
Right.
And there's nothing else going on. But usually when people tell us, you know, this only happens when the person's drunk, and we start asking questions, if you see that pattern where besides the physical abuse that only happens when there's alcohol, there might be some financial stuff, some emotional stuff that is happening all the time.
Right.
So that's the thing to look for.
I suppose it's worth mentioning that most of the time we think of, when there's domestic violence, we think of the woman. But I suppose it's worth mentioning that it can sometimes be the man that is the one that's abused in some situations. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And although we don't typically see it because of size and things of that nature, and we don't think of it that way, but it can happen.
Yeah, and I think part of it is also that we are so programmed to think about domestic violence as physical, right? That we tend to think about, oh, men tend to be bigger and physically stronger.
Right.
So when a man says, I'm actually in an abusive relationship, everybody dismisses it.
Yeah.
But the truth is, transition has been around for 40 years. We started working with women. Now we work with women and men. And we still find that we have way more survivors that are women.
Yes.
But we do work with men. And I think if we think about domestic violence as what I was saying, it's based on exercising power and control over another person. There's many other ways to do that. And there's many other social injustices and social inequalities that can be used in a relationship to control somebody. So we know that gender is one of the big ones that has been around for many decades, centuries. So this is, I think, why we still see a lot of women. We live in a society where there's a lot of sexism, and the way that we're socialized is still very much based on those old school principles, even when we don't notice. But then there's also other ways to do power and control. So one example that I always give is we work with a couple where the husband was the one that was being abused by his wife, where there was a lot of emotional and verbal abuse, not that much physical.
Name calling and things.
Name calling, putting down, harassing, like lots of jealousy, lots of phone calls at work, which can endanger your job actually.
The phone call.
Text messaging, confronting about you have to be home at this time. A lot of controlling of his movements, taking away the paycheck as soon as he got home. And then a lot of pressure because he was a recent immigrant. She was not. So that was something that was held over his head in terms of keeping control of the relationship.
Right.
So this is one example.
So the status of the threat of the status, or maybe even the communication that might be better here because the wife, they were married?
Yes.
The wife speaks the language,
Right.
the husband
Right.
is not so
Right.
fluent with the language, and so there's an edge up there.
Exactly.
And then that sometimes gets equated to intelligence, which really has nothing to do with it, right? You know, it's kind of funny when sometimes a witness, even someone that doesn't speak the language, and if they don't understand, the other person will raise their voice
Yeah.
to try to make them understand. It's
Right.
like it's not that they don't hear
It's
it.
like they're not deaf.
It's that they don't understand it. But don't
Right.
we do that as
Yes.
humans? Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
So transition house. It's one of the, you mentioned 40 years. They've been around for 40 years. They are located
right down the street in
right
Central Square.
down the street.
We're in the same building that the YWCA, and yeah, we move around Cambridge a lot though, because we do some walking hours also at the Cambridge Housing Authority every Tuesday, and we do a lot of community outreach and community workshops.
Well, that's good to know, because that's what I do as well, and maybe I'll invite you to some of the things that I do.
Oh, that'd be great.
But so tell us about the services that Transition House provides for people. And you may be listening to this show, and I hope you are, and you may be identifying, or some things may be resonating with you, or maybe someone that you know is in in relationship with someone and having some kinds of things like this.
Yeah.
So what can they do?
So what they can do is we have several services. So the service that we would have people contact first for something like that is our community program. We have a community program with 4 staff that are experienced social workers who work from age like newborns to as old as you can get with different areas of expertise. And what we do at the community program is both help people who are in the abusive relationship and are exploring their options and wondering, not necessarily maybe ready to leave, but just wanting to ask questions and figuring out, is this an abusive relationship that I'm in? Should I be doing something? Should I be planning something? To people who are...
Or what are my options?
Exactly.
Even? What, because often in an abusive relationship, people feel trapped.
Yeah.
Like there is nothing else.
Yeah. Especially when we're talking about Cambridge, we work mostly with people who are in Cambridge in the community program. Rents here are not cheap, let's just say. And sometimes even when people have made the decision, it's like, I'm out of here. Out of here doesn't necessarily mean that you can immediately afford to go and rent your own place or find an affordable place
on
for you and your children and one income. Exactly. So we guide people, we tell them what their rights are. We have a very close partnership with Cambridge Housing Authority. And Cambridge Housing Authority, like many other public housing authorities, has some special rules to help survivors of domestic violence that might be in these situations. So we help people, inform them of those rights, connect with Cambridge Housing.
So if I can just stop you there, do they hold some apartments maybe available for some kinds of things, or they make them more accessible?
Yes, so unfortunately there's such a shortage of housing, but what they do is they have a special emergency application that people can do for extenuating circumstances. Some of them is like recently when we had the fire here in Cambridge, some of the people that were left in the street because of the fire could apply for that emergency type of housing. So being a victim of domestic violence here in Cambridge has the same kind of status. So people can walk into the housing authority and just say, this is my situation, and of course there are some criteria, and that's where we can be of assistance navigating that. But there are certain things. Also, if somebody's already living in public housing and there are things happening in the apartment that might put their housing at risk, for example, or they need to get out of that apartment because something happened, Cambridge Housing Authority also has some protections for that. So they have some emergency transfers that they can do. There's some exceptions to their policy where somebody can come in and say, look, the reason why, there's a hole in the wall in my apartment and now you're asking me to pay for that, it's because this stuff is going on and it can be sorted out. So these are some of the things. Other things that we do, we accompany people to court, connect them to legal services, to medical services, do safety planning. So what that means is, regardless of where people are, if they're feeling unsafe, we can help them brainstorm and ask questions and figure out where to put things aside to kind of, regardless if they want to leave the relationship or not, to actually feel a little safer and have some protections around.
Because often you can feel quite alone.
Yeah, very alone.
Even if you have children, you know, you're the
Oh yeah.
you're the adult in the situation,
Right.
and you feel kind of alone.
Yeah, and we also have, this is the program that we have been most known for these 40 years on our emergency shelter. It's very small, it's located here in Cambridge, and that's for people who actually have to leave their home in a rush.
Emergently.
And they don't have where to go. So it offers...
That's a temporary?
That's temporary.
Mm-hmm.
And it offers 24/7 staff and support. For
Oh,
people.
so the support around the
Right.
clock.
Yeah.
So is there, do they have to pay for that? Is
No,
there-
all our services are absolutely free. Everything from the
Because
community
that
program.
it's good for
Yes.
them to know that.
No,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah. So all our services are free. Our emergency shelter is also free. And recently there have been some changes and some cuts in some of our funding, but we still have a few more longer term apartments, which is the same principle than the shelter, but allowing people, because it's very hard, as we were saying, even when you're like, okay, I'm ready to go, I got my job back, or whatever you need to do to feel ready. It's still very hard to find permanent housing, so we have a few apartments that are a little longer term, where people can stay for up to 2 years. Unfortunately,
Wow.
now with the current times and the funding,
Right.
those are a little bit on waiting, let's just say. So
As is everything else
Right.
these days.
right.
So, and there's no cost for that.
There's
either.
no cost for that either. Well,
So
there's a
even if
minimum
someone,
monthly-
if someone doesn't have a job,
Mhm.
and then it might allow someone to be
Yes.
able to have protection,
right.
get food,
Right.
and all
Exactly.
their survival needs
Yeah.
met, while they can go find a job.
Right. So for our shelter, we always say there's no cost. Doesn't matter if people have legal immigration status or not.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. The shelter is open
Protection.
to anybody, protection to anybody.
Well, that's
Some
really good
of
to know.
those longer term programs that I was talking about might have a nominal monthly fee that people pay once they get an income. That's not more than $100, depending on which program they're in.
Mhm.
And some of them do have some restrictions in terms of immigration status because they come through federal funding. So
Right.
there we can't,
Right.
we don't have a saying on it.
Right. So, well, this is definitely worthwhile knowing. So, do we have a number?
Yes,
that
we
maybe
have a
the
number.
folks, if they need to connect, and
Yes, you would think I would know it by heart, but I don't, so I have it here. So this is the number for our community program. What we do is we have a voicemail service where people can leave a message. We get back to people within 48 hours. And the number, we always say it's safe to call, because the message, if somebody gets your phone and says like, oh, let me see who you called last, doesn't say anything about transition house. Doesn't
Okay.
say anything about domestic violence.
so you mean on the caller
On
ID?
the caller ID, exactly.
Mhm.
So the number is 857-777-6724.
857.
777-6724. And that's our community program. We always say this is not a number for emergencies.
Mhm.
We tell people, and if you are in a situation where you are in danger, obviously call 911, call emergency services. This is more for people who might be listening to this and might be saying, it's like, you know what, I know somebody, maybe my mom, maybe my sister, maybe my brother that might be in this situation, or I just have questions about how does that work. So I'm in a situation, I was looking for housing, what kind of things are out there? This is the kind of number to call.
So let's talk a little bit about, we have a few more minutes left, this thing called a restraining order.
Uh-huh.
And so if people are in a relationship that's has domestic violence, what are the parameters in which someone, and where do you go to get a and what is a restraining order for people that might not know?
So in a minute, the restraining order, it's it's a civil protection, so I always say it's not like getting a query or getting a criminal record or anything. It's something that people can go to either district court or probate court if they have children. In your city, you can go to the closest court and they can request it. What it is, it's actually, and I always say that also, it's actually just a piece of paper, right? Because it doesn't change behaviors. It might with some people, but it's worth having a conversation about what the dangers might be. So you can appear in front of a judge, say, I'm in fear that this person is going to cause me physical harm. That's the standard for it. So a lot of these other
So
things
the
are not
standard is
physical.
physical.
It's not that it has happened, but that you have a well-founded fear.
Right.
And you
but I
feel-
mean
and
physical,
physical.
not mental, emotional,
No,
or verbal.
for a restraining order is based on physical.
Physical.
So then the judge, what they will do is just grant you a temporary one for
Right.
10 days
Mhm.
and say, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to find the person that you are afraid of. We're going to notify them that there's this
Has this order.
procedure going on. And then in 10 days, the judge wants to see both parts again. And then this is more like a hearing where both sides can say, I'm afraid of this person because of this and this and this, and the other person can say, no, that's actually not true, and the judge makes a decision if there's enough to grant it, and then they will grant it. It depends on the court, sometimes for 3 more months, sometimes for 6 more months, and then you can just keep going back and renewing it. So what that does is that if the person that you're afraid of does something, so they're asked by the court to stay away a certain distance. In the order, it can be included that they can see or not see the children if you have children, that they might not contact you either by phone. There's different things that you can check in the order that the judge can order. So if the person does any of those things and they call you the next day or they threaten you, you can report it to the police, and police knows that there's an order. So this is like a very quick process where now that person
They're on
can
alert.
end up
Right.
arrested
Yeah.
because they're violating an order.
So it's documentation,
Exactly.
really, more
It's
than
pro-
anything.
it's-
Oh,
yeah.
well, we are running out of time here. I thank you so much for coming on. We
welcome.
had certainly a lot to talk about, and I think we've got the important information out to our people. Do you think so?
Yeah, I think so.
Good. Well, thank you so much, Esther,
Thank
for coming
you.
on board. And thank you. I hope we have educated you in some ways to help those who need the help. Thank you.